Yeah, welcome everyone. Today we have a great webinar ready for you, focused on state policy with some folks here from NCSL. But we're going to start off today with our land acknowledgement as usual. So yeah, as funders and advocates working to create a more equitable U.S. agriculture and food system, SAFSF believes it is imperative for us to acknowledge that the roots of today's inequities lie deep in the history of land theft and dispossession from Indigenous peoples. I am based here in Charlottesville, Virginia, and Monacan and Monohowoc land. As you introduce yourselves in the chat, we encourage you to acknowledge the traditional Indigenous inhabitants of the land you are on and to learn more about that history. You can find maps and more resources on the land you're on at the links we're plugging into the chat. So yeah, thank you again for being here today. We're thrilled to have two experts from the National Conference of State Legislatures. Mindy Bridges is a project manager in NCSL's Environment, Energy, and Transportation program and focuses on environmental agricultural policy and also staffs NCSL's Task Force on Agriculture. Mindy has 9 years of experience in supporting intergovernmental and Native American affairs, policy analysis, and meeting facilitation. She enjoys applying her academic background in biology, cultural anthropology, and conflict resolution to her policy research, facilitation, and other projects at NCSL. We're also joined by Emily Mayer, who's a project manager in NCSL's Fiscal Affairs program and focuses on state budgets, intergovernmental relations, and economic development policy. She also staffs NCSL's Labor and Economic Development Committee. Prior to joining NCSL, Mayer served as a nonpartisan policy analyst for the city of Philadelphia, where she worked on retirement and economic policy. She received her bachelor's degree in political science and international service from American University, where she recently completed a master's in public administration and policy. So today, Mindy and Emily are going to be providing an overview of NCSL's work as it relates to food and agriculture, some background on the state legislative process, a review of how states are spending ARPA dollars, and what food and ag topics state legislatures are likely to continue working on in 2023. And then, yeah, we really want this session to be collaborative. So we're asking folks to answer questions ask questions as you have them. So you can either pop them in the chat or raise your hand and we will call on you as we go rather than saving them all for the end. So with that, I'm gonna turn things over to Mindy. Thanks, everyone.
Hi, everyone. So yeah, I'm Mindy Bridges with the National Conference of State Legislatures. Glad to be with you all today. I think I spoke to your group back in 2015 or 2016 about our local foods report, Harvesting Healthier Options, which was funded by the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future. So shameless plug, would love to update that report sometime if folks are interested in talking more about that. And I'll be talking about local foods legislation a little later on. So start us off today, just give you a overview of NCSL. We're the National Conference of State Legislatures. We're a bipartisan organization with nonpartisan staff serving legislators and legislative staff for almost 50 years, since 1975. And we promote policy innovation, create opportunities for lawmakers, share knowledge, and ensure state legislatures have a strong and cohesive voice in the federal system. So, happy to discuss more if you're interested in learning more about NCSL offline, but in the interest of time, I'll not go into too much more detail, but we really do love being a place for legislators to network, providing research to state legislatures. We conduct our own webinars. And talking to Maggie and Tracy preparing for this webinar, I have a few Zoom polls teed up to keep it a little more interactive. So sometimes my colleague Emily and I are testifying in front of legislatures, and so it's kind of nice to have a little more fun with your group today, hopefully. So yeah, again, use the chat, and I'll be sharing a few kind of trivia polls and talking about a few topics I wouldn't necessarily testify in front of a legislature. A few quick examples of our work specifically related to agriculture. So I also staff our agriculture task force, which meets in person at least twice per year. And then we also have virtual sessions throughout the year and, share information with our members, answer questions, provide technical assistance. And members are appointed by legislative leadership. So you might be familiar with, legislators in your state. And some of them might even be on the agriculture task force. Often these members are Senate and House Agriculture Committee chairs. Some of them are farmers and agricultural producers themselves, grew up on a farm, and often they're also from rural legislative districts. So they really, understand the issues that their constituents are facing and get a lot of value from our meetings when we bring folks together on a national level. And then just wanted to point out, we also have what's called a standing committee structure. So that is what our state federal affairs team works on. So don't ask me too much about the federal farm bill, but maybe you could have a future session on that. And my colleague, Kristen Hildreth in our DC office, is busy at work looking at the federal farm bill and how that's going to impact states and the priorities of our members. And policies are also worked through our standing committee called the Natural Resources and Infrastructure Committee. So all sorts of policies that, we might be engaging with USDA on, EPA on. So again, I'm not the federal affairs expert, but just want you to be aware that it's out there. But, I do love the Agriculture Task Force. I started making this presentation using, some stock photos. And I was like, why not use some photos from the task force? So I'll share a few task force stories along the way. Again, want this to be a little more conversational than a kind of dry legislative committee testimony hearing. So with that in mind, it's really kind of a broad brush today. I'm going to give you an overview of state legislatures, not too much on the process, how a bill becomes a law, but we can definitely talk a little bit about that. And I'll give you, my take on how legislatures get their work done and what's kind of different as you compare state to state. I'll give you a 2022 midterm elections update. My colleagues were just on another presentation yesterday, and there's a lot of interest in that. So we'll touch on that a little bit. And then, like Maggie mentioned, Emily will give an ARPA and fiscal recovery overview and highlight some examples in a wide variety of states. And then we'll close out with, a topic you're probably all in the weeds on, agricultural policy topics. Again, it's a broad brush. You'll probably have, other webinars this year on some of these specific topics. So I won't dig too much into detail, but give you kind of a broad brush range of the topics at hand. So yeah, again, ask questions in the chat. I'll try and keep an eye on that as well. And we'll, pause along the way. So to get us started, I'm going to launch our first poll. This was actually a real life trivia question at a trivia night that I went to. Which state has the only unicameral state legislature? So that means there's not a House and a Senate, there's just one body. So bicameral has a House and a Senate. So I'll give a little bit of time. But yeah, you might be able to win a trivia night question with this sometime. I had to argue with a friend about what the right answer was. I'm like, I work at the National Conference of State Legislatures. I think I know. So.
That's funny, Mindy. We should have, next time we'll give out some prizes.
Yeah, we at NCSL host like trivia nights with legislative staff during like legislative staff appreciation week and stuff like that. Yeah, one of our programs will if we were in person, I'd be throwing candy at you if you're winning the prizes, but can't do that virtually. So
there is a legislative resolution right now to eliminate our unicameral system in Nebraska and institute party process too. So we got to defeat that. Yeah,
so Tracy gave away the answer. She knows. Yeah,
sorry,
so Nebraska, no, I was just about to reveal it, so it's perfect timing. Yeah, so Nebraska is the unicameral state legislature. So yeah, just a little trivia to keep things interesting today. So the next couple slides is from our awesome staff with the NCSL Center for Legislative Strengthening. And, again, I don't get to talk about this that much in a work setting. I share this with friends and colleagues and stuff. I hope you find it very interesting. You can hone in on your state, but kind of think about what state you're from and how it might compare to other states. And I'll just note that our Center for Legislative Strengthening is also working on their demographic survey right now. So, I'm curious to see how many legislators are also, active farmers or working in the agricultural industry. That'll be an interesting kind of tidbit to see if we can pull that from the data. And again, they do really great work. And so, I think a key takeaway is no two legislatures are the same. Even two chambers within the same legislature might operate differently. And there's, all sorts of interesting stories about rivalry between, the House and the Senate sides. And so, here's a framework and kind of thinking about the different types of legislatures in the country. There's the dark green, full-time, well-paid, and large staff. So, you might think of California, typically there, full-time light. So, maybe not as large of a staff, maybe not as high of a salary. Then a hybrid, kind of a mix of, you know, they're in session pretty long, they have a decent sized staff. And then we go into the part-time state. So that's kind of the yellow and orange color here. So, you know, there's some states that meet every other year, like Texas. So they're, you know, they're hybrid, but they have kind of larger staff. It's just kind of an interesting thing to think about when you're comparing how your legislature operates as compared to other states. And yeah, so like part-time citizen legislatures are like Wyoming and North Dakota, and then gray states are somewhere in between. Again, this is, I'm sharing notes from our colleagues at the Center for Legislative Strengthening, so I might read a little bit more than normal. You know, and I'll just, yeah, so like Florida is a gray state because it has a lot of staff and one of the most in the country, and its sessions are relatively short. And so the majority of members report, you know, somewhere in between full-time and part-time. So they're able to, you know, have another job on the side, and thus, you know, so their pay as a legislator is, you know, a little bit low on the lower side comparatively across the country. And then, you know, also point out New York, they're a full-time legislature. They really don't have any limits on the timing of their sessions. It's really a full-time job, and it's one of the highest base salaries in the country, and they have lots of staff. So I'll pull up one more trivia question. There's two in here. And I'll keep maybe talking while you answer it. But yeah, here's some stats on kind of the national average of what legislators get paid. The national average is around $39,000. So yeah, there's two questions. You have to scroll down and click one, but you know, which one has the largest House of Representatives and which one has the smallest Senate? I'll keep sharing some interesting slides. So keeping on, you know, the subject of legislative staff while you think of these trivia questions, you know, our members are both legislators and legislative staff are so important to the legislative institution. We have staff sections that serve our legislative staff. You know, according to the studies done by the Center for Legislative Strengthening, legislative staff sizes across the country have stayed pretty stable since 2015. So, you know, take that as you will. It's not growing, it's not decreasing, it's pretty stable. So, okay, let's give some answers to these questions. So the answers to the questions. So the largest is actually New Hampshire. It has 400 members, and they're kind of a citizen legislature as well. And the smallest one is Alaska. So let's see, let me scroll down. So yeah, most of you got that right. And they have 20 members in the Alaska Senate. So, you know, a little bit more trivia too. Wyoming actually gained more members in 2023. So they added one seat to their Senate. It went from 30 to 31, and then 2 in their House. So went from 60 to 62. So these numbers aren't actually static. They are changing. So I don't know if there's any, I think people are introducing themselves in the chat. Okay. So yeah, just want to, you know, draw attention to the importance of legislative staff. Sometimes they're the institutional knowledge, you know, committee staff are very important to the policymaking process. So talking about the policymaking process, you know, sometimes you think of 2 times a year and it's not really a line in the sand, but, you know, often, especially right now, our attention is focused on during session, you know, looking at legislative calendars, looking at how bills are working their way through the committee structures, which is also always changing. I just learned that Vermont recently named their relevant committee of jurisdiction for agricultural topics. It's now called the Committee on Agriculture, Food Resiliency, and Forestry. And so, you know, as you're paying attention to your state legislature, you'll want to see, you know, where bills are originating in the committee structure as well. And then something, you know, I think folks don't always have a great appreciation for is what happens during the interim. So there's sometimes study committees that'll just meet for 1 year. There's interim committees that might meet every year. And often these committees are meeting across the state. So one example that I spoke to a few years ago is the Georgia House Rural Development Council. So they met in towns across Georgia. They weren't just meeting in the capital and learning about different rural development issues, including, of course, agricultural issues. There's been a lot, I'll talk about water policy later on. There's been a lot of interim committees on water policy topics. Maine, Colorado, Maine had a study committee this year. Colorado, New Mexico, Western states, their interim committees do a lot of the work in the summer, and tours and visits across the state, not just at the state capitol, are really important to this process. And so, some of the ideas come up during the interim. So I think with that, I don't know, I want to just check for questions real quick. I'm going to move on to the midterm election. So again, I'm not the elections expert, but I think this is really interesting stuff to share with all of you from our elections and redistricting team. So a few key takeaways, Democrats overperformed expectations in the election. Republicans still have more control. And again, this is for state legislatures, so not talking about the US Congress necessarily. There's been a decline in the split control of government, and then women continue to make some gains in the legislatures. So kind of some interesting visuals here that I'll just go through really quickly. This is how the composition of state legislative seats by parties have changed since 1900 to the present day. And then this is how party control of the legislature, so the majority party in control, has changed as well. So, we'll be sharing the slides, but I think these are really some interesting graphics to look at over time. Kind of don't get too much of a headache looking at it though. So prior to the 2022 election, there were 61 chambers that were held by Republicans, and 62 if you count Nebraska's unicameral legislature, which is officially nonpartisan, but it's essentially under Republican control, and Democrats held 37. And so then the post-election composition shifted a little bit. There were 4 flips. The final count was 57 Republican-controlled chambers and 41 Democrat-controlled chambers. So some states are clearly showing up some of their majorities. In West Virginia, the Senate now stands at 88 Republicans and 12 Democrats. And then of course in Hawaii, the Senate, Democrats have the edge of 23-2. So something we're always keeping track of, next election, definitely check out our resources. We're, live tweeting and live streaming some of this information. So stay tuned for more if you're interested. So current state control, this map shows the combination of both the legislature and the governor's branch. The bottom line is more states are under one party control after this election than previously. So it's been a continuing trend since the 2010s. And then just something I'll quickly note too is, oh, sorry, going a little too fast. The majority of states also have veto-proof majorities. So if you're working with your state legislature, something to be aware of if you're advocating for bills or, thinking through the legislative process, good dynamics to keep in mind. And then just one more thing I'll highlight quickly is, there's another trend of growing number of women in state legislatures. It's now at 32% as of this year. A few stats from Nevada and Colorado. In the photos, actually, Representative Joanna McClinton, who's in House Majority Leadership in Pennsylvania. So a lot of information, but I think it's, helpful to be aware of, not something I always get present about, but something, I think is really interesting to keep in mind as we dig into the more specific policy topics. So with that, I will turn it over to Emily.
Great, thanks, Mindy. And if from the introductions, I'm originally from Pennsylvania, so that last photo is actually Leader McClinton in Pennsylvania. And if anyone's from Pennsylvania or following their legislature right now, there's a lot going on. So we try and track that closely too. And Mindy, when you were talking about the trivia, I'm so embarrassed to share that I was at a recent trivia and the trivia category was like state borders or state shapes, and I mixed up Delaware and New Hampshire, and my whole team was like riding on me to get it right. And I was just so embarrassed. But anyway, it does come in handy to know this stuff at trivia. So again, my name is Emily Mayer, and I am a project manager in NCSL's Fiscal Affairs program. I've sort of been living and breathing these fiscal recovery funds, the federal stimulus funds under the pandemic the last few years. But aside from that, I also cover state budget processes and economic development topics. Next slide. So I'll be giving an overview of what ARPA is, the most recent kind of large federal stimulus package, what NCSL is doing to track the ARPA funds. And when I say ARPA, I really mean sort of the flexible funds, those fiscal recovery funds, state and local, and the process that states are taking to make decisions on those funds, and some fiscal considerations that we're hearing from lawmakers and legislative staff. So lawmakers, legislators are legislating in some really curious times right now through 6 different stimulus bills. In little over a year, the US has seen nearly $5.2 trillion plugged into the economy. The 2 biggest bills that you're likely aware of are the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, better known as CARES Act, and then the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA. And those really large bills provided quite a lot of flexible funding to state, local, territory, and tribal governments. And just to hone in deeper, I'm a really big visual person of the magnitude of the federal relief. I love this chart from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget to compare the federal response under the Great Recession versus the pandemic. On the left is in blue, the blue bars are funding under the Great Recession, and in orange are the big funds under COVID. This time, the feds inserted nearly twice as much GDP into the economy, the much more targeted, flexible relief compared to the Great Recession, whereas those funds, the ARA funds, some of you may know, were a little bit more formula and competitive grants directly to agencies. So these pandemic funds were supersized and super fast, and just a portion of these funds is compared to the size of the New Deal under FDR. Next slide. So the more recent coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery funds was $350 billion split between state, local, territory, and tribal governments. That's 2.5 times more than the previous flexible funds under the CARES Act, those coronavirus relief funds. Broadly, this funding measure, this package, provided a lot more flexibility than the previous funds under the CARES Act. States can use their funds this time around for premium pay, for government services related to revenue loss, and the biggest one really is investments in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. The funds can't be used towards pensions or tax cuts to offset revenue. And the big dates here are the funds must be obligated by the end of 2024 and spent by the end of 2026. So right now, a lot of states are in that process of getting the funds out the door, allocated, implemented, and getting those projects up and running. So a lot of those states are still considering the funds in this legislative session. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Next slide. So there has been a recent expansion of the eligible uses under these funds. Again, these funds are pretty flexible as it is, but the recent amendment under the federal omnibus provides even more flexibility related to infrastructure, and even under the local assistance and tribal consistency fund. So the amendment allows states to use $10 million or up to 30% of their funds towards transportation infrastructure projects. It expands the use around housing and community development and other investments related to natural disasters. It also provides some flexibility for Treasury to do some administrative stuff that doesn't really come up on our radar too much, but they provide a lot of technical assistance, especially to those smaller governments. Treasury has to issue guidance around these funds within 60 days of the passage of this amendment. So we expect more to come on details on how recipients can actually use these funds, probably in March. Next slide. And here's sort of a breakdown of how the $350 billion is distributed to recipients. So this time around, there was a lot more funding going directly to local governments. States received $195.3 billion based on a formula around unemployment rates. And it was distributed in either one or two tranches, depending upon that rate. So if a state's unemployment rate was really high, they received all of their funding all at once. And if it was, well, I mean, many unemployment rates were high, but if it was a little lower than the benchmark they hit, then states received their funds in two tranches over a year. All of those funds have been distributed to states. For tribal governments, the allocation methodology was a little bit different. I wanted to point this out since I think there are some folks that work in tribal governments or with them. The allocation methodology was $1 million divided equally among tribal governments, and a second payment was determined by 2019 employment numbers. And according to Treasury, 99.9% of those funds have been distributed. So I'm assuming that 0.1% is going to be distributed soon here, but this is kind of a nice breakdown of all of those direct recipients. And that's not to say that states maybe are or are not supporting local governments, but local governments, territories, and tribal governments have a lot more autonomy over how they can use their funds. So that, $130.2 billion to local governments is their money. States can't tell them what to do, and vice versa, but they can collaborate with each other or provide grants, and that usually comes from the top down. Next slide. Again, another really good visual here to get a good sense of sort of how these funds compare to the size of state budgets. I use this chart from the Pew Charitable Trust to show the size of aid compared to their state budgets in FY 2020. And the influx of funding really ranges drastically from Wyoming at nearly 23% to Tennessee at 10% and Wisconsin at 5%. And so this is excluding all of the other funding under ARPA and the pandemic bills and the large infrastructure bill that passed last year and the Inflation Reduction Act. So it's just like a lot of money coming into states. And it's sort of a double-edged sword, so that funding is really necessary and appreciated, but it's also a lot of responsibility to get those funds out the door in an effective manner within the deadline. Next slide. So NCSL has been tracking these allocations. We have a database that I'm happy to share in a bit here of how states are allocating their funds. And we break it down into programmatic details, and it ranges from legislative to executive action. These funds are unanticipated federal funds. So they kind of function a little bit differently, and it depends on the state's constitution as to who has say over how the funds can be used. But to date, all 50 states and DC and all territories have allocated at least a portion of their funds. In green are the states that have taken legislative action, in orange, executive, and that pattern is sort of this collaborative framework within their constitution where both branches have authority over the funds. Our database has, I think around 3,000 entries at this point, and it provides, again, a lot of details on the programs, and I'm going to provide a few examples here in a bit that might be of interest to you, but I encourage you to check it out. Treasury also has a lot of expenditure data, and there's a lot of oversight measures happening around these funds at the state, federal, and local level. So these are sort of the broader allocation categories. There are just 11 here, but we break it down into 15 in our database. With the flexibility and the guidance, more allocations are being devoted towards revenue replacement. It's a really big category, and it's kind of hard to track, but a lot of states are using their funds towards revenue replacement. And that can encompass anything from housing development to public employee benefits to even, something like water infrastructure, or they can decide to use the expanded flexibility with water and sewer infrastructure, which is another really big bucket, and broadband as well. Public health is still a major priority. Housing and human service actions around food banks, workforce development, but those are sort of smaller expenditures. they might be coming more frequently because there's more programs associated with something like economic development relief or small business relief, but those expenditures are just a little bit smaller. And then the larger expenditures come with that water, sewer, broadband, and revenue loss categories. Next slide. So over the next few slides, I just pulled out a few examples I hope would be of interest to you all from our database. I also pulled some examples from the recovery plan performance reports that states are required to submit annually. Much of the agriculture and environmental uses fall under Treasury's expenditure categories of negative economic impact and revenue loss. Something like food security can also fall under public health. So I pulled out a few examples here. I'm not going to go over each one just for the interest in time, but I know these slides are going to be shared later. I thought that Alaska's use of the $625,000, oh, sorry, Mindy, was super interesting. And just to provide a little bit more context, they are actually providing, they're purchasing frozen salmon for disproportionately impacted communities and distributing them by Native community tribal councils. So I think that there's a lot of really interesting and unique allocations out there based on, community and state needs, and they all kind of look a little bit different. It makes our job really interesting.
Yeah, so there's a question in the chat about, do you have a sense of whether states are treating this like a one-time windfall or want to start new programs that they want to maintain in the future? In the food and ag world, there's a lot of interest in new things at the state level, like soil health, because states are saying on some money.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Mindy, for reading it off too. So it sort of depends. And I have a slide on this later about like sort of the fiscal cliff, but states are trying to be very careful with the fact that these are just one-time funds. So there is a lot of attention focused around just one-time uses for those funds, as opposed to reoccurring expenses, because eventually, the funds with the deadline will run out. And then if any sort of new programs exist, they have to pull from another funding source, their general fund, or make additional cuts elsewhere to continue funding them past the deadline. So it's a little bit of a mix, but I'd say they're leaning more towards these one-time expenditures. However, we've seen states create programs that are maybe like pilot programs that they've been thinking about for years, but haven't had the flexibility or funding to do so, around like housing or utilities or food infrastructure or agriculture. So these like pilot programs exist and new programs are being created, but there is a lot of consideration and intention of just like how to fund those programs in the long term, and also how to communicate to the public that those programs have a deadline. And so that's kind of this like challenging balance that legislators are facing right now, because they're trying to make this transformative change that's long term, but they're also trying to balance these budget cliffs that could happen later on. And there is a lot of surplus coming into states, but there's some noise in that data as well. So I hope that answers your question. A little bit of mix, but there's a lot of discussion around one-time versus recurring funds. And I probably talked too much about that, but we'll move on. So there is a lot of attention around just like small business support and workforce support to stabilize and support workforce and small businesses. And much of that in the ag world, it looks like grants for education and training opportunities, bolstering small businesses around sort of helping with their market access and to fill their own revenue losses to offset their profit margin losses. Next slide. And then several states have used the funds for water restoration and land preservation efforts. Florida, Colorado, and Utah are just some good examples here I pulled out. Florida has actually done a lot around this area. They also have devoted funds towards fish and wildlife conservation, and they have a lot of water infrastructure projects, including their funding towards Everglades restoration. And then I'm pulling this out. This isn't necessarily within the realm of you all, but I thought that it was important to note within these funds, the federal government has asked recipients to talk about how they're using their funds for targeted communities, disproportionately impacted communities, or, you know, creating equitable access to these funds. So I pulled out a few examples here. This is a little bit different than the previous flexible funds. It takes a much more evidence-based approach to utilizing these funds to address those communities and actually report on sort of their impact and design and goals around those funding measures. And then just quickly here, so the allocation timeline went fast and furious a little bit with these funds, but right now we're in this like post-second tranche. So all the funds have come into states. They're deciding how to get those funds out the door for their FY 2024 budgets, and there may be some left over next legislative session for their FY 25 budgets, but they'll need to get those spent very quickly. Another challenge that I want to note here, just in terms of the last question, going back just a little bit, is sort of building up the workforce to actually implement these programs has been challenging, and managing some inflationary pressures as well. So states right now are kind of in that mode. The pandemic still exists, of course, but you know, they're kind of shifting their priorities as the years go on. Next slide. Sorry.
Yeah, I know, maybe I shouldn't just keep interrupting you.
Oh, sorry.
There's an interesting, well, it just popped up in the chat. And I don't know, I'm not sure about the answer, but it's really interesting. Would you know if soil and water include the definition of infrastructure for agriculture?
That is a great question. I can look it up while Mindy's going through her next portion of the presentation and the FAQs, or I can get back to you with an answer after the presentation. The infrastructure side of things we'll know more about in about a month, but I can look at it for whether or not it's included in agriculture in the FAQs.
Great.
And just quickly, states are taking a lot of different approaches to implementation of these funds. They understand sort of the responsibility that they have, and it is a fast and furious timeline, but it's not as fast and furious as those coronavirus relief funds, which had to get out the door in like 8 months before the deadline was extended. So this time around, states have had about 3 or 4 years to actually get those funds obligated. So they're taking a step back, taking a breath, and taking a little bit more of a methodical approach to getting these funds out the door, setting priorities and criteria to do so. And that looks different in every state. Next slide. And this kind of comes back to that fiscal cliff comment earlier. You know, managing one-time expenditures, non-reoccurring versus reoccurring, sort of states are figuring out ways to budget that within their FY 24 and FY 25 budgets, coordinating with local governments to the extent that they can, especially around water and sewer infrastructure projects, inserting sort of oversight measures so that the funds are being used for what they are supposed to be used for without burdening a lot of those oversight offices as well. Just keeping in mind, like localities, for example, have to provide oversight, or they might have to provide oversight to their local auditor, their state auditor, and the federal government. So it's a lot of administrative support. And then there's a lot of discussion around long-term fiscal planning, multi-year budgeting practices, being flexible with investment strategies. So it's kind of that inflationary tone there, adjusting for the influx of state revenues and federal stimulus. So just managing what those projects look like from year to year, and really planning beyond ARPA when these funds don't exist anymore. And I do see another question that came in. So water, what would water be, especially big Western water systems? The kind of soil health stuff some groups want to do would be a lot of research, technical assistance types of things. So that may be a stretch for infrastructure, but maybe a way to do some of it with a climate focus. Patty, I think that I'm happy to follow up in the guidance to sort of look at some of that language, because it can be pretty specific, but I think that would fall under water infrastructure as an expenditure. Oh, sorry. Well, I hope that helped regardless. But I can look into those questions and happy to follow up later in this presentation or after the fact. And I will toss it back over to Mindy. I hope the fiscal folks on the line enjoyed that. please feel free to ask more questions. I'll try to get back to you.
Yeah, and really appreciate commentary in the chat too, especially for the next few slides or portion of this webinar, because it's going to be kind of a broad brush. You're probably the experts on some of these in the different, regions, states, communities that you're working on. And I really appreciate, Emily. I think we're in an interesting moment in time, coming out of the pandemic and, all the funds available. And I think it's just helpful background for you all to be aware of when you're, thinking about legislation in certain states. This is top of mind for legislators. So some of the, agriculture policy topics I'm going to go over are maybe not, aligned or part of your priorities as a group. I think it's helpful to be aware of kind of the sphere of the agricultural policy space and what other topics legislators are considering and top of their mind as you might be, considering discussing other topics with them too. So, a few key ones right now. I mentioned before, I'm going to talk a little bit about local food systems. Love talking about water from a few different angles, and already some great discussion in the chat about water. Land and land use, always a really interesting topic to come at from a few different angles. Connecting with Emily's work in economic development to, supply chains will continue to be of great interest to state legislatures. And then there's kind of a underlying theme with all of this. I had mentioned the new Vermont committee name included the term food resiliency. And so, hearing the word resiliency more and more in the state agricultural policy space, and it means a lot of different things. So kind of watch out for that in the next few slides, and we can talk about that a little bit more later. So local food systems. So this photo is from our Denver Agriculture Task Force meeting this past August. We were touring the Colorado State University facility that's brand new in Denver. There's 3 different buildings. This one building works with local food producers. It kind of has like a food incubator space. It has this grow space on top. It has a soil testing lab that used to be up at Fort Collins, where the flagship Colorado State University is. And so, just want to share a few photos from our task force meetings, maybe make you a little jealous you weren't there. But yeah, so local food system legislation means a lot of different things, and definitely has had some renewed attention in the current times that we're in. One example I'll point out, Maryland in 2021 created the Food System Resiliency Council. And so that council is intended to address food security issues and develop recommendations for the resiliency of the food system. So that could mean planning and increasing production and procurement of what they call Maryland certified food. You'll hear lots of different terms for, Colorado proud, Georgia grown, these different state systems. And also, as you've probably thought about in your work, how you're even defining local food. And Maryland already had a statewide food policy council, which is another, trend you see in this space. So this new Food System Resiliency Council will be reporting recommendations to both the legislature, the General Assembly, and then also the Food Policy Council that already exists. Another area in this space, we're always seeing some legislation. We just are working on updating our webpage, and I'll include some links to share with Maggie and Tracy to follow up with you afterwards with some of our resources, including the one Emily mentioned earlier. We're going to keep seeing probably legislation that relate to farmers markets, and have seen, several bills in recent years. Some of those bills relate to permits. Illinois just enacted legislation last year. Accessibility and nutrition programs will continue to be a common topic. You may have heard of the Double Up Bucks program, which provides a dollar-to-dollar match for SNAP recipients. And another topic that definitely relates to farmers markets that saw, a lot of legislation in recent years, and also pending bills in the current session, overlaps with food safety. So cottage food bills, home produced food bills. South Carolina just enacted legislation in 2021 that helped to support and regulate what is called home-based food production operations. So if you're not familiar with this area, it's kind of foods that can be safely produced in someone's homes and then sold at a farmer's market is the easiest way. So you might think of salsas, popcorns, some cookies, different things like that. Interestingly, Kentucky's considering a bill that would add whole or ground roasted coffee beans and dried tea leaves to their definition of what a home-based processor is. So, you don't necessarily need to be in an industrial grade kitchen to produce those items. So, there might be already a bill or a statute in your state, but these are constantly being amended as awareness of the issues develop over time. So definitely a really interesting topic. Also, Hawaii has a pending bill that's going to support cottage food sales as well. So very important to the local food system in states and communities, because it really allows often direct sales from producers to consumers, which can be a really important part for addressing a wide range of issues. You might have also heard of the term Food Freedom Act. So Maine, North Dakota, and Utah and Wyoming all have food freedom acts, which are even broader than these cottage food laws. These type of laws actually exempt home producers from all sorts of food safety laws, licensing, permitting, and inspections, and allow those direct sales to consumers. So again, really important to different food systems and communities, and providing different opportunities for new producers as well. And then related to this space too, I also want to point out food donations and food waste. We've seen, bills over the years, and we'll probably continue to see bills. For example, Montana is considering a bill right now to establish a farm to food bank grant program. So I've mentioned a few bills already, and I didn't, do my disclaimer, but, it is really tricky to talk about bills that are currently pending. By the moment maybe this recording is shared, some of these bills might have already failed in their legislature, and it's hard to have a pulse on all the kind of in the Capitol building conversations about going on with these bills, but wanted to give you like a flavor of what's currently being considered and what's being considered, or what was enacted in the last 2 to 3 years. So I think one more example, you'll hear several examples from New York. They've had a package of bills in recent years, really focused on local food systems. And again, this term resiliency keeps coming up. So they enacted a pretty broad farm and food supply resiliency bill, which directed the Commissioner of Agricultural Markets to also work with the Commissioner of Economic Development, as well as the state's land-grant university, to provide recommendations on resiliency and self-reliance of the state's farm and food supply. In addition to that, they also had the Local Food and Farms and Jobs Act. That's a mouthful. Also looking at healthy foods, food insecurity, and state-grown food. So, once a bill becomes a law, you have to see how it's going to be implemented. So stay tuned for probably more on the implementation side coming out of New York. So I will move on to one of my favorite topics, water. We've had some great chat already about water, and you can look at it in a lot of different ways in the agricultural space. So this photo is actually from a barge that we were on with the Agriculture Task Force in St. Louis. You might have seen the news, last fall about how low the Mississippi River was. And, some barges and vessels weren't able to travel down it. And so, for a while, I think folks really thought about drought as a Western issue and something, Western states have to deal with. And it can be so much more than that. We're actually planning an NCSL webinar in a few weeks that I think is open to the public, so you'd be able to register for it. It's our Water Resilient Agriculture webinar, part of our committee series. I think it'll be scheduled for March 3rd. And I can share the link with Maggie and Tracy to share with all of you. So, you're still going to see a lot of bills from Western states on these issues. Another example is Arizona enacted a bill last year that developed an on-farm irrigation efficiency pilot program. So a lot of these drought resiliency bills are working with farmers on, how to promote conservation practices, do the same with less water available. And you will continue to see a lot of these from Western states. But again, we're going to see, more and more interest from non-Western states as well. So, related to that are these statewide water planning efforts. And of course, the agricultural sector is such a key player when you're considering, the future of water use and water resource management in a state. So, common states you might think about is, Colorado, Texas has had a very robust regional planning effort that they've amended and developed over the last few years. So it's definitely a work in progress, but, as an example, other states have looked to. New Mexico has legislation right now looking at regional water planning efforts as well. But then non-Western states, so Connecticut just worked on approving its own water plan in 2018 after a few years of development. And I think, Emily had mentioned Florida and the Everglades earlier. Florida in 2016 actually passed a comprehensive and long-term water policy plan that worked with the agricultural producers. I believe the State Farm Bureau was involved with that. So again, this is not just, a Western issue in terms of drought and state water supply planning. And I think another piece of this to keep in mind for the water lovers in the room, there's also more attention on surface water versus groundwater dynamics. So there's been some great research from the National Agricultural Law Center about high capacity wells. Are agricultural producers using groundwater to supplement surface water supplies? So another kind of topic to be aware of. And of course, in the space is water quality. We could have a whole, hour or two on water quality efforts, best management practices for producers, how state legislatures consider policy options that, provide incentives to producers. The Agriculture Task Force talked about a few policy options in Wisconsin and Ohio when we've gone to various meetings. So, definitely happy to talk more about that, but giving you the broad brush. And then, of course, waters of the US is top of mind, and how states will be responding to those kind of federal developments. So before I move on, I see a question in the chat. How many states have locally controlled offices to manage and regulate water issues? So that's kind of a tricky question. So we could talk about water governance in different states. Western states, we talk about prior appropriation, first in time, first in right. Other states have riparian water rights. So that kind of management, that the questions getting at in the chat can get to, are you managing the supply issues? Are you managing the quality issues? Soil and water conservation districts. Minnesota has a pretty interesting history of developing their water governance structure, and now they have a one watershed, one plan approach. And so, yeah, a lot to parse apart there, Tracy, and not really answering the question, but yeah, you can look at kind of the local management of water at the watershed level, in addition to kind of a, local government municipality level. So dancing around that question a little bit, but it's an interesting way to think about it. Okay, moving on to land. So we got water and we got land. Yeah, soil health is definitely getting more attention from state legislatures. Like I kind of briefly mentioned before, we're really busy at NCSL tracking current legislation, the current session, seeing what's proposed, seeing what's failed, seeing what's enacted, vetoed, all that. And sometimes you don't always get a chance to step back and look at the implementation of programs. And so I think a lot of states were really looking to California and what they've done with soil health, but there's definitely a lot of work in other states, and probably some of the states you're from as well. I know there's a little bit of discussion about soil health earlier in the chat, and so a few states, and this again is not the whole landscape of all the work being done, but in Colorado, there was legislation in 2021 that created a voluntary soil health program, which could include a grant program, a monitoring system to actually understand the benefits of these practices, as well as a state soil health inventory platform and a testing program. So, it'll be interesting to see now that the legislation is passed, what's actually happening with the implementation. Nebraska, in 2019, established their Healthy Soil Task Force, which developed an action plan and submitted that in 2021. Perhaps Tracy's been tracking that, being from Nebraska, you know, and seeing what the legislature does with those task force recommendations. And then also I'll mention, you know, New Mexico briefly, they enacted their Healthy Soil Act in 2019. And, you know, I think just pulling a quote about the goal of that act is, you know, interesting how different states frame these initiatives. Their initiative says to promote and support farming and ranching systems and other forms of land management that increase soil organic matter, aggregate stability, microbiology, and water retention to improve the health, yield, and profitability of the soils in the state. So there's a lot there, but you know, yeah, thinking about the profitability of soil, you know, is very important to the implementation of these bills, because you need funding to implement bills. And currently in New Mexico too, they have a program to donate your state tax refund to the Healthy Soil Program. So just an interesting tidbit from New Mexico there. Also add New Hampshire, New York also had recently enacted legislation related to soil health. And then, you know, again, with this broad brush approach, I wanted to mention, of course, the important issue of access and preservation. You know, we'll continue to see different bills related to new and beginning farmers, farmland preservation, veteran farmers. I know your group might be interested in a few bills related to different populations. New Jersey enacted a bill just last year in 2022 that established a state minority women and underserved farmer registry. So understanding those different populations in their state and helping to support them. And then New York is also a great example of their state young farmers loan forgiveness incentive program. So another kind of approach to getting younger farmers on the land and connecting, you know, farmers who are retiring to their land as part of this farmland preservation piece. And then, okay, a couple questions in the chat. So yeah, are states working on legislation to address investor speculation and ownership of land? So I'll point out foreign ownership has been a really hot topic. The National Agricultural Law Center from the University of Arkansas has some great resources, and they're tracking it very closely. According to them, there's laws in at least 15 states, and currently there's at least 17 states that have proposed legislation in the current session. We're also getting requests from this at NCSL, and this topic here, you know, is a little bit more specific than your question, Maggie, but it's, you know, really looking at limiting or even, you know, restricting, banning ownership of U.S. lands by foreign persons or entities. So that could be foreign-owned investors, foreign-owned corporations, definitely getting a lot of attention there. You know, Indiana just enacted a bill that restricted a foreign business entity from purchasing certain types of land. So states are, you know, since there isn't, you know, necessarily an initiative at the federal level that's enacted, states are, you know, trying to solve this on their own. And then another question in the chat, land values continue to go up and pricing all but the wealthiest farmers who are large landowners. Yeah, so we haven't been researching investor speculation. It's kind of interesting because there is some work being done on water speculation and water trading. But yeah, I could get back to you, Tracy, on some more details about that. And then, yeah, again, with this theme of resiliency and land use, I wanted to point out an interesting bill from the U.S. Virgin Islands. They're actually working on developing a seed banking program. So if you haven't heard of seed banking, these types of programs preserve seeds against natural disasters and other changing conditions. So just wanted to throw that out there in this kind of broad brush approach and this idea of resiliency. So, you know, in addition to the topics already mentioned, there's even more agricultural policy topics we could talk about. Specialty crops. We've talked with the Agriculture Task Force in Massachusetts about cranberries and what the state agency has done to support the cranberry industry in that state. You know, you could consider hemp a specialty crop. You know, hemp was a very hot topic in state legislatures for the last few years, and now hemp is definitely moving into more of a food safety product issue. So you might have seen, you know, hemp legislation in your own states. laws. Yeah, one other kind of specialty farm tidbit. I didn't realize I was pulling all these Pennsylvania examples with Emily, but the Pennsylvania State Farm Bill mentions their priority specialty crops as hardwoods, hemp, and hops. So kind of an interesting selection there, just to give you a sampling. Animal agriculture laws, this can tie into local food systems. Definitely seeing an uptick in legislation related to meat and poultry processing, protection of the dairy industry. Michigan had a few bills related to the dairy industry this past session. You'll also see different animal welfare bills, including, cage-free egg laws. And then agritourism will continue to be a hot topic as states continue to refine these policies. There's a lot of great resources out there with agritourism. Think, pumpkin picking patches, corn mazes. These agritourism products or projects provide an extra revenue stream for farm producers. And so legislators who are really interested in supporting farmers in their districts are going to, figure out ways to support their constituents through agritourism related legislation. And then, didn't want to get too much into pesticide legislation on this call, but, happy to at a later date. Chemicals and technology will continue to be a hot topic as well, whether that means pesticides, drones, right to repair legislation. PFAS is a really interesting topic right now from an environmental health perspective, and also impacting the agricultural industry as well. And then, Emily mentioned workforce, and so I just want to mention workforce and education again. You've probably heard of farm to school programs. Those will continue to be of interest to state legislatures and kind of tie into that agricultural education piece, depending on how they're developed and framed. There's a lot of different grant programs states have looked at in the space, youth development programs, supporting FFA programs, 4-H programs, in those spaces as well. So I'll keep going along, give us a little bit of time to chat at the end, but a few highlights from our agriculture task force meeting in Savannah that I think just represent the range of issues that these legislatures are thinking about. We toured the port, you're thinking about port and transportation and trade issues. Pollinator legislation will continue to be of interest, as well as products and marketing of, honey. We visited the Savannah Bee Company. And then aquaculture is a really interesting topic that Emily, touched on briefly with some of her examples. We toured the University of Georgia Extension Service Center, and they're doing great work with their oyster farms in the region. And so, really shout out to Extension Service as well and their role working with state legislatures as well. So
Mindy, there's a question in the chat.
Okay, so does NCSL work on federal preemption of state laws? And Emily, feel free to jump in. Yeah, so that's what our state federal affairs program often works on. If we have policies through our standing committees, and I can include a link on that if you want to see our national agricultural policy. And so, like I mentioned earlier, we want to ensure that state legislatures have a strong, cohesive voice in the federal system. And so, yeah, often that comes up with the very question you're asking. Emily, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think you hit it on, on the head, but we do really advocate for states where our partners or colleagues in DC on the Hill are kind of advocating for state rights and, against unfunded mandates. So our NRI, our Natural Resource and Infrastructure Committee, would likely work on something like this, and we're happy to follow up with them to see if this has come up on their radar recently.
Yeah, and we also talk about, kind of unfunded mandates, whether there's, making sure states have the capacity and funding to implement what, might be passed at the federal level as well. Great. Okay, yeah, so just kind of wrap things up there. Yeah, legislatures are very diverse, but that doesn't mean they're not learning from each other. Might want to take a great idea from another state and propose it in their state, you know, especially for part-time legislatures, or, you know, just the connections I've seen from, you know, Colorado legislator reaching out to North Dakota legislator to talk about, you know, a bill, and they might be from different parties, but, you know, NCSL really tries to create a space for those members to cross party lines and, you know, just share those great ideas and connections as well. You know, and then elections matter, funding's important, and then, you know, just this word resiliency keeps popping up in the agricultural space. And so, you know, again, it can mean a lot of things to different people, you know, natural disaster resiliency with drought, food resiliency with response to COVID and local food systems, resilient water supplies, you know, a lot of different things. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of highlight that. And yeah, a quick plug for our legislative summit in August in Indianapolis, great place for ag. And yeah, we'll wrap up there.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Mindy and Emily. I really, really appreciate your time today. And just it looks like we have about 6 more minutes. So I definitely want to make space for any additional questions from our members of the audience here.
Yeah, and I guess I had another poll, but if folks are interested.
You have another trivia question? Yeah.
No,
yeah,
it's just like getting it. Oh no, not this one. Yeah, I'm just kind of curious, and we can definitely, you know, talk about this more, like how folks are engaging with, you know, local elected officials, state legislators, state governors' offices. Yeah, sorry to cut you off, Maggie, but I was just
no, that's okay. I was that's actually kind of transitions into one of my questions, which was just kind of thinking about like what you think the most impactful role for funders and philanthropy are, and kind of engaging in advocacy at the state level. And if, you know, you can think of particular examples that have been really successful, would be great to hear.
Yeah, so, you know, at least like with our role with NCSL, and we, you know, do receive grants to do this, is educating state legislators. You know, legislators are voting on so many different policy topics. Sometimes, you know, if they're the chair of a committee, or, you know, they have a certain background, they might become an expert in certain topics, but they, you know, they're also, you know, they might be the chair of the agriculture committee, but they're also voting on an education bill and a budget bill and a, you know, just the whole range of things. And so, you know, getting good information to legislators is definitely what we do. And, you know, there's definitely a role for local groups to do that as well, to educate legislators on the issues. Emily, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, a large part of what we do is sort of the education. We're like tracking research and getting that out to folks. And a lot of that does come through grants and relationships with funders. But we also do a lot of convenings in person outside of the legislative summit, like the task force. And that's really a networking opportunity. And states really do learn from each other at those meetings and from experts. And oftentimes we will see sort of like, we're not advocating for specific policies, but they might share ideas at those meetings, and those ideas may be proposed within the next legislative summit. Or in my world, something like budget stress testing has been percolating for like a decade, and now it's kind of happening in more and more states. And part of that is just getting them in the same room together to share ideas and sometimes commiserate. A lot of that comes with our funders as well.
Yeah, and I guess I'm thinking too, like some non-NCSL examples that might be state-based too. There's, you know, different legislatures might have like an agriculture day at the Capitol, which is a great opportunity for groups to come and interact with legislatures. I also think it's really interesting. There's some states that will do agriculture tours for urban legislators, and not that agriculture is all rural, of course, as we know, but, you know, bringing some legislators that aren't as familiar with agriculture rural issues to different areas. You know, I think Oregon had an example. Iowa a few years ago had a great example. I don't know if it's still active. So yeah, just a way to, you know, educate maybe some other legislators who aren't as familiar with those issues as well. And then there's also, you know, some state-based grant-funded programs that are agriculture fellows programs. I know Colorado has one that legislators and other members of organizations have applied to be like a state agriculture fellow or leaders fellow. So there's a lot of different ways that folks can plug in and make sure, legislators are understanding these issues.
Awesome. Fantastic. Well, yeah, thank you. Oh, looks like Tracy had one other question, which is what about racial equity issues within agriculture? Any state doing things around that? And yeah, I think Emily, you touched on that a little bit with that kind of Treasury Department guidance around ARPA dollars, really trying to address racial inequity.
Yeah. It's with those federal funds too. I mean, it will, we don't take a stance on sort of like how the federal government does their business, but it's helpful to kind of see that they are implementing those sort of like accountability measures with the funds and having those sort of evidence-based pieces and making it more targeted, because there is a lot of like discussion around sort of just like oversight and implementation of those funds. Mindy, you might be able to point to more specific examples around agriculture, but the states are definitely sort of taking a different lens with these funds because of that encouragement. It's actually not a requirement, but they're very much encouraged to do so. And Mindy, I'll turn it to you.
Yeah, so I mentioned the one New Jersey bill. So I'm not, I haven't seen a ton of legislation on that issue. There might be some happening at, the governor executive level. And so that would trickle down to state agencies if it's not legislated. But yeah, we'll be keeping an eye on that this session for sure.
Fantastic. Well, it looks like we're right at 2:15 Eastern, so brings us to the conclusion of this webinar. But yeah, thank you again so much to Mindy and Emily for sharing your time with us today. I think this was a really, really informative session. I know I learned quite a bit about what's on the docket. And yeah, thank you to everyone for being here today. I think I mentioned that we will definitely be sharing the recording as well as the slides that Emily and Mindy went through today. And we will follow up with the resources that were mentioned, including the ARPA tracker database and all of the things we discussed. And yeah, also please stay tuned for more webinars and content related to state and local policy. It's definitely something that Tracy and I are pretty excited to continue doing more programming on throughout the year. So yeah, with that, I think I will end our meeting there. And again, thank you so much for your time today, and we will be in touch.